from Belgium. Within 2 to 3 months since the government recorded the first case, that is from March to May, Tanzania had a total number of cases of 509 cases, 12 deaths, and 183 recoveries. One may wonder why the COVID cases in Tanzania are very low compared to other East African countries, that is Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. But this is because since May 2020, for unknown reasons, the government of Tanzania stopped reporting and announcing COVID cases, but rather the emphasis was and is still on promoting alternative remedies and putting God first, as well as taking precautions as per WHO to fight the novel coronavirus. As you may know, people have reacted differently to the pandemic. Unlike Western countries, in multiple African countries, and Tanzania particularly, large number of people have embraced indigenous healing and medicinal practices in the response to COVID pandemic. National biomedical institutions and government figures have explicitly endorsed particular local and indigenous medicines for their capacity to combat the virus. Against this short background, my ongoing projects asks several questions. Could we go to slide number 5? Slide number 5. The first question that my project asks is, how do Tanzanians experience and perceive indigenous healing and medicinal practices in response to COVID-19? Secondly, how ordinary Tanzanians apprehend the efficacy of these medicines and practices relative to those advocated by global health authorities. Number 3, how they frame these indigenous medicines discursively, for instance, in relation to particular notions of Africanness. Number 4, which is the next slide, how and why certain healing and medicinal practices are coded as religious and why others are coded as indigenous, local, African, or cultural. Number 6, how government messaging has impacted or shaped these practices. And lastly, how different health modalities shape people's perceptions and the practices in responding to the virus, and how their responses reshape government communications and messaging. Next slide. Methodologically, I'm doing ethnographic study, particularly in 3 places. One, in commercial outlets selling Tanzanian-made herbal remedies, and secondly, in premises offering steam inhalation services, particularly at the National Hospital, and thirdly, in informal street corner gatherings where people exchange various information, including COVID pandemic. Now, generally, the next slide, the general findings. Now I'd like to present the general findings. No doubt that to the majority of my interlocutors, COVID-19 continues being perceived as a dangerous pandemic. And this is due to the fact that it has no cure yet. It spreads very rapidly, and the disease kills very quickly. To most of my interlocutors, they had never experienced in their lifetime a disease like COVID, which can kill thousands of people per day. In some other people, COVID and especially its symptoms were associated with other diseases such as malaria, UTI, and asthma. Although the pandemic has widely been regarded as posing threat to their lives, to other people, they perceived it as being a Western disease, that is economic competition between China and the USA, and therefore has no devastating impact to Africans. As you can see, that's one of the cartoon from Uganda, which are widely circulated in the social media, indicating that in the today's context, in the context of COVID-19, before COVID-19, most of Africans were migrating to Europe, and Europe was saying no, stay in Africa. But nowadays, in the context of COVID-19, which is considered some people as a Western disease, and now some Westerners are coming to Africa, and now people are saying, no, you stay in your continent. This is a kind of perception which shares that a Western, COVID-19 is perceived to be a Western disease to some of my interlocutors that I interviewed. But next slide. Despite these varied perceptions, the most effective preventive and curative method that people used and continue using to fight the pandemic are two. One, traditional responses like using local herbs such as eucalyptus leaves, neem tree, leaves of a mango tree and a guava tree for steam inhalation, which is famously known as kujifukiza or kupiga nyungu. But again, there is consuming of a lot of ginger, lemon, and other concoctions. But others still respond to the pandemic by using amoxicillin, Piriton, and other pharmaceutical-related drugs for flu. On top of these responses, there is also one response which I would call it like putting God first and relying to his help. And this is where I will capitalize very soon. Before going in detail, to the majority, traditional healing was preferred to hospitals. Among the reasons that my interlocutors mentioned are fear of getting the infection in the hospital, social isolated in quarantines, and if one dies, restricted to few members who would attend burial, stigmatized by the healthcare providers, no one to take care of the family or support to the family in case the admitted is the head or the household winner, poor health infrastructures in the country, and availability of local herbs, medicines in places of residence, such as neem tree, are widely present and widely spread in Dar es Salaam. But again, there is the belief that a belief and a trust of effectiveness of traditional healing in a complete cure of illnesses, such as illnesses and symptoms related to COVID-19. As you can see, that is one of my that's the quotation from one of my interlocutor, which tries to explain or emphasize why he did not go to the hospital. And he says, first, I did not want to put myself under pressure. First, in health facilities like hospitals, whenever patients went there, even if they were not COVID positive, they were regarded as positive. Sometimes the healthcare providers isolated the patients who showed up COVID-related symptoms, and at times it was said that the corona diagnostic kits that we were using in the country were faulty, and in the manner that they returned positive results even to people who were not. From these identified reasons, I did not want to go to the hospital. First, the doctors would isolate me. Secondly, I would put myself under pressure. And thirdly, the testing results and the medications would generate or create worries in me. That's the quotation from one of my interlocutors. Therefore, self-treatment, and particularly the use of local herbs for steam inhalation, or kupiga nyungu as famously known in Tanzania, consuming a lot of ginger, lemon juice, and concoctions of herbs, and putting God first, were used as alternative to going to hospitals. Although to some people, such medications were considered to be initial treatments, others said that they would turn to hospitals if the symptoms became severe or if there were appropriate cure or medications in the hospitals. Could we go to the next slide, please? As far as the theme of today's discussion is concerned, allow me to capitalize a bit more on religious responses, and particularly the churches as healing landscapes during COVID-19. Often people in my interviews mention to rely on prayers and fasting for the sake of alleviating, preventing, or curing the pandemic. Unlike in other pandemics, COVID-19 was perceived to be exceptional in terms of its spread, rates of infections, as well as fatalities. Furthermore, the fact that the pandemic has no cure yet and originated from areas where we depend on for social and economic development influenced many people to seek God's mercy. For instance, these are some of the two quotations that I took from my interlocutors. One is, COVID-19 has a lot of things. First, it's a life-threatening disease. It has killed 4,000 people on one day. Secondly, those countries, referring European countries and China, with well-improved medical facilities have failed to contain its spread. Therefore, we, referring Tanzania, has no way out rather than returning to God. The second one is, God says, call me if you have problems and I will listen to you. We joined together as a nation and prayed. And we decided to pray because of lacking support to fight the pandemic. Why do you think we prayed for this pandemic and not other pandemics such as HIV/AIDS? There are a lot of quotes which have a similar content, but other interlocutors said that they participated in the 3-day national prayers against the pandemic in the country. The next slide. The use of prayers to fight the pandemic was highly influenced by the late Tanzanian President John Pombe Magufuli, who throughout the pandemic outbreak emphasized putting God first. And in different occasions, he requested people to pray on their own convenient time and places. Could we go to the next slide? Besides mobilizing people to pray, the late President Magufuli in different occasions declared that Tanzania was free from COVID-19 because as the country, we had put God first and he had answered our prayers. His belief in the effectiveness of prayers and fasting in responding to the pandemic is also shared by some of my interlocutors who say, like this one, who said religious organizations had a lot of contributions here in Tanzania because any human being belongs to God and therefore he or she must be of God. For any problem, they must return to his help. God says we must depend on him for everything and we must ask him anything and he will give us. In my memories, I remember religious organizations spent 3 days of prayers and fasting in order to alleviate the virus. And we can say that to great percentage, this has helped us so much because we have not been affected as our friends in other countries have been affected. Could we turn to the next slide? These activities of praying and fasting were done in outdoor, that means in churches, mosques, shrines, and indoor settings like in families' homes. These sites which were considered to have spiritual significance. In churches, for example, priests and pastors organized the prayers or specific prayer sessions to deal with the pandemic. Besides this, key religious figures provided COVID-19 education to their followers on how to prevent themselves from the virus. For instance, one of my interlocutors said, I am a Roman Catholic believer. In churches, the priest always preached and advised people to wear masks, wash hands with water, keeping social distance, and following other related advice as given by health authorities. Therefore, churches and the mosque became sites for achieving physical, mental, and spiritual healing. They also had a supportive environment for fighting the COVID-19, such as water pipes for washing one's hands and pictures emphasizing wearing masks. As such, they adhered to the recommendations and the guidance to religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and faith communities in the context of COVID-19. Okay, this is the next slide, okay. Spending time, no, the previous one. Spending time in churches and the mosque during COVID-19 was an outcome of the interplay of many factors such as social, political, economic, and individual factors. For instance, during the outbreak of the pandemic, unlike Western countries, Tanzania did not close or lock down churches and the mosque. Rather, the government allowed people to continue going to holy places to ask for God's aid. As such, they were mobilized to put God first. Although this was a source of solace or hope during desperation, it appears that the mobilization of a region took into consideration that the health infrastructure in Tanzania were not prepared to respond to the pandemic, and there were no external support at hand. However, some people feared going to churches for fear of getting infections. That means the healing sites were unhealthy. For those who did not go to churches or mosque, opted to pray and fast, as well as using other local remedies in their homes. Therefore, their homes became everyday sites or spatial context in therapeutic healing. Based on the above therapeutic healing in churches and homes, home remedy during COVID-19 outbreak, only two issues that emerge out in my ongoing project. One is that I see the quasi-scientific response of churches to the COVID-19 because on one hand, they are promoting or insisting people to wear a mask. But again, on the other hand, they are promoting people to believe in God and trust in God for their help. But again, secondly, what I see lastly is on the local behaviors through which people find their ways of health. Next slide. Yeah, this is a concluding slide, which I see the quasi-scientific approach that the government, the religious, the churches are taking. But again, which I emphasize that turning to churches or spending time to churches was the outcome of many factors, social, political, economic, as well as in the individual factors. Thank you for listening to me. This is still an ongoing project, but I wanted to a little bit reflect on the religious responses to COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the presentation of your work in progress. And it is really interesting to hear about the findings that you have gained so far and the direction that your research is taking. The next presenter is Dr. Matthew Michaels, who I hope has joined us and is able to present. Matthew, are you able to? Are you here? Okay. Matthew does show up in the list of attendees, so I don't know what is happening. Anyway, let's continue with the other presentations. Matthew did send me the text of his presentation, so if he is not able to join us later, then I can summarize some of the key findings that he wrote down in his paper. But let's move on first to the third presenter then, Dr. Fyodor Mazumutima, who is a World Vision consultant in Burundi, and who will be presenting about the impact of COVID-19 on the peace-building activities of local faith actors in Burundi. Theo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me also thank you for inviting me to this forum. And I would like to request that we put up my slides, my PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
I have a very weak internet, so it may not work from here. I may not even see what you are going to put on the screen. So just bear with me. And then I will go as well off video. As you've just heard, I'm going to present on the impact of COVID-19 on peace-building activities of local faith actors in Burundi. And just on the second slide, I'm going to, for some of you who might not know much about Burundi, Burundi is a country in East African region, and we are very far from Tanzania. We are between Tanzania and Democratic, and so the kind of activities of peace building which we are referring to are as a result of the 2015 crisis, and so the crisis has been going on for the last.
I'm Dr. Matthew Michael of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies in Nasarawa State University in Nigeria. I'm working on a paper titled COVID, African Transportable Spirituality and the Crossing of Ecumenical Border at Refugee Camp in Northern Nigeria. This is part of a larger conversation and project initiated by the University of Leeds, United Kingdom, with the title of Religious Engagement and COVID Response. They try to see how religious community around the world have interact and converse around the emergence of COVID in different faith communities. In our studies, we are particularly researching the Christian refugee community in southern Kaduna. We map out 2 Christian refugee communities located in Kajuru and Zankoa, respectively. Our quest is to understand the dynamics of spirituality within these refugee camps, particularly the way Christianity and the way spirituality have been engaging the discourse around COVID-19, and it is very fascinating the kind of insight and development we see in the refugee camps, basically brought about by the presence of the pandemic in northern Nigeria. But to put things in perspectives, we need to give you a very brief background to the conflict between Christian and Muslim in northern Nigeria and how the pandemic and violence converged in the refugee camps. In 1804, it begins in 1804 when a Fulani cleric by name Uthman Dan Fodio decided to wage a jihad over the Hausa states and the minority tribe in northern Nigeria. From his own perspective, he believed that what the Muslim them in northern Nigeria were not practicing the true Islam spelled out in the Quran. And so he waged a holy war against all the Hausa states, conquering them and imposing on them his own tribal men, the Fulanis, as emirs over the conquered region of urban towns and cities. He imposed on these places that are conquered, he imposed Fulanis as the emir. And so those structures, these emirate structures, constitute together a caliphate that has its headquarters in Sokoto. After his demise, this conflict between the minority tribes in southern Kaduna with a burgeoning presence of Islam became so very complex when Christianity came in. The missionary came in 19th century to northern Nigeria, and they find a reception among the minority tribe who have associated Islam with oppression and colonial conquest. So they refused to identify with Islam, and most of the minority tribe in northern Nigeria, in southern Kaduna, in Plateau State, in Gombe, Bauchi, Benue, gave their life to Christ and were converted. And so this set a lot of tension between now a minority Christianized community and a dominant Islamic emirate and caliphate in northern Nigeria. And this tension continues over time, and it has in many ways evolved into Boko Haram, into Fulani herdsmen attack, into a lot of terrorism that we see now in northern Nigeria. And the Fulanis have actually have transported violence around. And our finding has been very interesting. We have discovered a lot of interesting findings. One of the things we discovered is there is a kind of awakening. There is a kind of awakening in northern Nigeria, a kind of epiphany, what I've described as an epiphany, and in a sober reflection of the Christian heritage being given to them by the missionaries. There's a lot of what soul searching among the Christian communities in the refugee camp, and this is at the level of spiritual awakening in many ways. One of the ways a kind of spiritual awakening is the fact that what it alienates itself. The spiritual awakening itself alienates itself from mainstream Pentecostals believe that healing and wellness is for every Christian who believe, and prosperity is promised by God for every Christian believer who believe. These two myths of modern African Pentecostalism were shattered in the refugee camp, because these Christians find it awkward now to relate with that kind of Christianity. They are alienated from that kind of Christianity, and so there's a kind of awakening amidst this refugee camp that what if wellness is for everybody, if healing and wellness is for every Christian who believe, why is the pandemic killing people in northern Nigeria? Why are people becoming victim of a pandemic if actually people should have faith and to take them through that every sickness should not be their portion and all those kind of theology. So there is a kind of such searching and reawakening that said, well, no, this doesn't fit the context, the historical context they find themselves. And the talk of prosperity doesn't make sense anymore to them, because what these people have been dislocated from their home, from their houses, from their farmlands, from their properties were destroyed. A lot of their siblings, their husbands, their wives have been killed. And so prosperity doesn't really make sense to them any longer in the context they find themselves. And so the context itself is a context of spiritual awakening in this dimension, because what they are alienated from dominant Pentecostal belief that make it look like what if you are a Christian you have good health, if you are a Christian you have to prosper and everything you have to live in success. This doesn't longer resonate with they are contented with the little they can get. It is not about how the former sacred spaces of their faith, their churches, they have been burned down, their community, they have been. No, it's not about those. Some of them want to return to those places, but again, their religion, their spirituality is no longer tied down to a sacred space. Their religion is transportable. Is not alienated from mainstream Pentecostalism, alienated from the government, alienated from their homeland, and in this new context of mobility, their Christianity and spirituality have adopted a transportability, which for me is very, very interesting. And another thing we discover is the fact that what they have also tried to integrate themselves, not only working together in the refugee camps, but they have also tried to integrate themselves with the larger Christian family and extended African traditional family structure. What I mean by this is this: last year, when at the peak of the pandemic, when this violent attack against this community, some of them rushed and they were given, like the ones in Zonkwa, they were given public school to accommodate them as their place of as their houses. So they were housed in public school. So, but when the public school resumed this year, early this year around January, it became a problem. How will they live, cohabit the same space with public school? So the Christian community in the camp decided to integrate most of them back to extended family and also into Christian family who are willing to accept them. And by doing this, by this integrating of the Christian refugee individual into family, it decongest the physical refugee camp. And this for me is also very interesting, because it shows how African traditional values of communalism, integration has been appropriated in the story of these Christian refugees in the camp. Another thing dynamics that I also noted in this study is the fact that there is the crossing of a communicable border, and the same way also the spirituality of this Christian is becoming more transportable. And for me, What it means for global Christianity is this, that as the pandemic moved in conversation with violence and displacement of people, it creates new evolving spirituality, new ways of what negotiation Christian identity in the context of this pandemic and terrorist background or context. And I think this context will continue to give birth to new and intriguing way Christian faith evolve and is reflected based upon the concrete context that it meets in other parts of the world. For us in northern Nigeria and among the Christian refugee camps, we think this is a new interesting dynamics which could give a new strength, a new emerging identity for Christianity, and it negotiation with other issues in the context, especially emanating from the presence of COVID-19 and the violent background that this Christian minority group find themselves. Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate the time given to me to present this paper. This is just a summary of some of the findings in our conversation with the Christian refugees in these two camps. We hope that this conversation will translate into a lot of theological, academic studies that will give us better perspectives of what is taking place among the refugee camps in northern Nigeria. But it's an interesting beginning, and we hope that at the end of this project we'll be able to have a total understanding of the dynamics at work at this particular time in the history of Christianity in northern Nigeria. Thank you. Do have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Okay. Our next speaker in the panel on religious responses to COVID in global contexts is Dr. Theodore Mazumutima, who works as a World Vision consultant in Burundi. And the title of his presentation is The Impact of COVID-19 on the Peace-Building Activities of Local Faith Actors in Burundi. Theo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me. And my presentation is an ongoing study which combines two countries, Sri Lanka and Burundi. And we are looking at the role of local faith factors in peace building initiatives in these two countries, and how COVID-19 has impacted this work. I am going to present the case of Burundi. Please note, we are still continuing the research, but these are preliminary results. If you could go to the slide where it is written "Setting the Scene," slide number 2.
Okay, I've done that.
For those of you who might not know Burundi is a country which is locked in between Tanzania, Republic Democratic of Congo, and Rwanda. And just to spare you from a long political discourse, I'm going just to explain a little bit about the crisis that led to the current problems that we have in the country. And this was the 2015 elections, in which the then President Nkurunziza wanted to vie for a third term, which the opposition qualified as unacceptable, as unconstitutional. But then the president went ahead and got it after being cleared by the Constitutional Court. This led the country into a big crisis, as the opposition and some civil society organizations decided to go to the street. But really, as we were doing the research, we asked the respondents, who were mostly the local faith leaders, and then the civil society organization, the international NGOs, and representative of women and the youth groups that have been very much affected by this crisis. We wanted to know what they think was the cause of the 2015 crisis. And basically, some of them said that they thought that the cause was the president who wanted another mandate, which was unconstitutional. Those were really the immediate causes, but others went on to blame the international conspiracy against the government, so the unconstitutional change by especially the Western countries who wanted mines in Burundi and generally a way out into Congo via Burundi. And they thought the then government was not facilitating that. Some other respondents spoke of a wave of causes ranging from historical unfinished businesses between Burundians, but also the most immediate problems of unemployment and political problems, the opposition not having enough space in the country's management, and a number of many causes that made the situation complex. So there was a coup d'etat that failed, and this changed the whole situation in Burundi. The government became very aggressive and very powerful, especially against the opposition and the civil society organizations that were demonstrating against the government. And so the reaction of the government was tougher, and it was that of an authoritarian government, or rather semi-authoritarian government, that was trying to control and bring peace as they said. So when I was talking to the respondent and the many church organizations and Muslims and other faith actors, they were in unison that at one point it was very difficult to differentiate between CNDD-FDD and the president, who called himself, by the way, a born-again Christian, and religion. So there was, at the same time, even if there were many political problems and wrangles, there was a big move by the CNDD-FDD to put God first. And this was even materialized in the constitution that was promulgated in 2018. But basically, the CNDD-FDD decided to put the sacred and the politics together. And this gave a very difficult choice to the church, having the Roman Catholic, especially church, on the side and criticizing the government, very much verbally criticizing what the government was doing and all the human right abuses that were taking place, and the government accusing the church of being of working for the colonial masters and working together to oppose actually the government. On the other side, there were a good number of Protestant churches who saw in the claims of the president a divine appointment, and they at least wanted to support him, or thought his claims were genuine, and then saw in him rather somebody who should be supported. But some of them, even the Protestant churches, did not want to support the government, and they saw their leaders being changed in what is being seen by my respondent as a move by the government to remove the kind of leaders in the churches that were not supporting the CNDD-FDD government. So other churches, they decided to have a low profile just to become resilient, because this government was really controlling and having all the controlling power from political, social, and economic, as well as religious institution. We have Muslims who either tried to actually be silent and did things their own way without necessarily making a lot of noise. And actually it all finished at a point when the government had already politicized the whole discourse or narrative of peace building. So peace building was a political choice against the government that was trying to say that we have peace in the country. And this is what the Roman Catholic chose, and they had to be blamed for it. And then the Protestant churches decided rather to engage in less political activities, rather socio-economic activities, to try to relieve the population that was really suffering as a result of the crisis. Next slide.
Okay, you have about 7 minutes left.
Yep, that should be all right. And so as churches and different faith actors tried to work hard to try to engage in peace building, there was the COVID-19 that broke in. In the first instance, the government was very much in a denial point, and like the president, like the Tanzanian president, the Burundian president also denied in the first instance the existence or at least the threat of COVID-19, and decided to call people to pray although there were some measures that were taken, like the closure of the airport and some washing hands and some other decisions, the measures to control the spread of this pandemic, it was by and large not accepted as a big threat, and so business remained as usual, and schools were opened, meetings took place. And I think many of my respondents loved the decision to let things continue the way they were, because they believed that it would have been worse economically, and the poor would have been affected if they were confinement like in our neighboring countries. Nevertheless, because they were borders were closed, the economy was hard hit, and it was already agonizing from the sanctions that had been imposed by the West. So the local faith actors and other peace actors reported that most of the programs were stopped because the funding could not come through, or simply it was impossible to execute them because they were part of a regional effort. And so religious leaders also responded that they tried hard to engage to limit the damage of the COVID-19, but by and large, it really affected their work and their initiatives. And part of the adaptation strategy was actually to try and change their the message delivery methods by using the social media to pass on the messages, the peace messages and other messages, but also they tried as much as possible to accompany the government and follow what the government was trying to give. Next slide.
Okay. So that's a slide on COVID's impact on peace building, right?
So it's the conclusion now.
Conclusion, okay.
Yes. Basically, what the study tried to find was that, and what the study is trying to argue is that the crisis, whether political or otherwise, like the COVID, are always connected to a complex of issues that have to be well understood if an intervention is to be designed. It was claimed that the 2015 crisis led to a total control of the sphere of the whole sphere of life by the CNDD-FDD and the President Nkurunziza. The religious organizations and local faith actors did not escape from this control, not least because the government decided to put God first, both at the party and the government level. Therefore, the government directly or indirectly dictated conditions under which religious organizations had to operate. In a context where peace building itself was politicized and seen by the government as not a priority, the local faith actors oriented their activities towards the less political peace building activities, while those that did otherwise, like the Roman Catholic, were assimilated to the enemies of the nation. Even though some local faith actors did their best and protected lives and protected lives that were in danger, but however, the COVID-19 brought a lot of damage to the different initiatives depending on the outside world support, and they could no longer get those support. So COVID-19 also affected the economy and the country that was already badly hit by the sanctions imposed by the West. The study showed that some of the local faith actors were still innovative and managed to modestly contribute to peace and addressed COVID-19 consequences. In all this, partnership was key, and it was clear that most projects were implemented in partnership with non-Burundian organizations. However, it was also mentioned that those partnerships were affected by numerous problems that made it difficult for the local peace actors to fully achieve their objective. So in conclusion, we have a situation basically of the victor and the vanquished, or the victor being the government dictating and putting flames in which the vanquished, which was basically the opposition and the civil society organizations, including local favor actors, had to operate in, trying to operate outside that frame that was set by the government was interpreted as fighting the government. And today we have a new government which is changing narratives, and so the narrative of peace is being depoliticized, but the faith actors are quite slow to adapt. They have been hypnotized, they are in fear, so much so that they can't see even that opening that is taking place. And so the major basically recommendations are that faith actors should try to understand really what the conflict is, do a conflict analysis, and if possible, reach out to this new government that is now open and maybe chat together ways on how they can complement one another. And the Burundian government should really open up a discussion space so that COVID-19 can be addressed and the economy of Burundi can be rebuilt. Otherwise, if not done, it carries within itself the germs of future conflict. And the donor community and the local actors, as well as the government, should engage in genuine partnership that put the needs of the beneficiaries population first. And finally, it is very important to do a study and try to understand what it means when CNDD-FDD has a project of putting God first in all the spheres of the country life. It is important to understand that this, because this project could lead to a big opportunity by religious institution, but also it could be a danger leading to melting religious initiatives and identity into the government action and identity. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Theo, for such a very insightful analysis of the situation in Burundi, and in particular, the history of the relationships between the church and the government, and in the context of conflict and peace building, and how that impacts on the current COVID response. That was really insightful.
Thank you so much.
still demanded support for Panea. There were a few interfaith initiatives, particularly for relief and joint advocacy supporting the burial rights, and also several other activities. And then let me check. I think no, I can't move. The third wave. In the third wave, actually the disease spread to all the communities. In the first and the second wave, there was a tendency to blame certain communities as the carriers of the disease. But in the third wave, which started in April this year, actually a new cluster was formed, and it was called the New Year cluster, implicating the Sinhala Buddhist and the Tamil and almost everybody in the country. And also in the third wave, vaccination program started, but it experienced some difficulties due to difficulty in obtaining vaccines in the initial period. And also there another important, perhaps positive development is a civil society forum was established actually just a few weeks ago to basically coordinate civil society engagements, including religious support for COVID-19 related relief services. And the hate campaign almost stopped. And the religious engagement increased despite the challenges. Of course, in the third pandemic, you know, no religion could practice their regular religious practices because the temples were closed and the mosques were closed. But they shifted from physical religious activity to, you know, like sometimes Zoom activity, but more often loudspeakers were used. For instance, in Buddhist temples, they chanted Pirit, which is like kind of blessing for people in a disaster, and they use loudspeakers to basically broadcast this Pirit chanting, and the assumption was that it will benefit not only the Buddhist community but other communities as well. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Okay, you have about 3 minutes left, Tudor.
Okay, so then we have to go very fast. Okay, so pre-pandemic politics and ethno-religious tension. Probably you have heard that there was a kind of anti-Muslim campaign in Sri Lanka by pro-Buddhist certain nationalist groups from 2012 onwards. And then there was a terror attack by a small group of Islamic fundamentalists in April 2019. And then there was a presidential election in 2019 and a general election in August 2020, where the Sinhala Buddhist Nationalist Political Alliance actually gained a landslide victory. Next slide, please. These are some pictures showing the hate campaign, particularly during the first wave. You know, like in this Facebook post, you know, Muslims are blamed for 2019 Easter Sunday attack as well as 2020 COVID-19. Both are seen as kind of deliberate interventions by Islamic groups to harm the country. Next one. Maybe you can skip the next two slides. It's the same, more or less the same. And then we go to, actually in the, this was in relation to the campaign for burial rights among Muslims. There were some actually Buddhist monks who collaborated with Muslim campaigners to demand the burial rights of Muslims, but there were also a lot of Buddhist monks who were opposed to it. So there was some kind of confrontation, religiously aligned confrontation with regard to burial rights. Next one, please. Next slide, please. I will skip that. And also they have a lot of religiously inspired relief programs by different religions, Buddhist, Islam and Hindu, and Christian also, which is not shown here. One important feature of this charity work is that they were not targeting only members of their own religion. They were also trying to help people from other religions, and also in raising funds also they did the same thing. So there was some kind of interfaith collaboration in both fundraising and relief work during this relief services. Skip the next 2 slides. This is Hinduism and this is Islam, and this is actually a document prepared by the 2 Buddhist sects supporting, actually this is writing to the President of Sri Lanka, supporting the burial campaign of Muslims, with of course signed by people from different religious groups, including these 2 sects. Next slide, please. Okay, now we come to the last 2 slides and conclusions. The important point is that the impact of religious activism on state policies. So as I told you earlier, the state policies became very majoritarian and illiberal, particularly in the first phase. But many religious actors did not like this, and there were campaigns against it, at least on the part of certain religious groups. And the government, in some ways gave some concessions. For instance, burial was accepted in February, March 2021, partly as a result of these campaigns. And also there may be one of the questions I want to put to this group is the escalating pandemic perceived as a common predicament of all, which actually perhaps encourage people to come to a common platform. There are tendencies on both sides, so I will not give my response on this quickly, but so far on the basis of preliminary information we have collected, we have evidence supporting both points. And then the escalation of pandemic among all groups in the country served to undermine the hate campaign triggered during the first wave. Actually, there is some sort of a realization in the third wave that all are vulnerable, irrespective of ethnicity and religion. So that is quite important. And I'm sure you have heard this statement, "We are all in it together." This is the statement by Secretary General of the United Nations last year. There is something like that in this evolving developments. During the pandemic, especially in the third wave, people are more concerned about the disease threat and material deprivation than any collective threat from other ethnic groups. So this may be a kind of opportunity for religious groups actually in this last phase. And can we move to the last slide? Okay, and also one of the points that I'm making in this presentation is that internal divisions within religions can sometimes contribute towards social harmony and peace building. I'm mentioning this because these 2 sects, Buddhist sects, actually challenge the dominant Buddhist sect in Sri Lanka in supporting the Muslim campaign for burial rights. So that we see as a positive development. Religious and interreligious interventions for diffusion of tension, there were quite a few, and there were some pictures which I could not describe in detail. Some religious leaders from southern Sri Lanka actually visited eastern province during the second wave, basically to diffuse tension, because in eastern Sri Lanka there were some confrontations about land rights and archaeological sites and things like that. And some religious leaders from different religious groups came together and tried to diffuse this tension. And also there are several religiously inspired platforms for promoting religious harmony. These were established, some of them were established quite long ago, but they are getting involved into peace process right now, and I have listed some of them. Dharma Shakti Foundation, and also famous institute called Walpola Rahula Institute. Walpola Rahula being a very popular, famous Buddhist scholar in Sri Lanka, and this institute tries to develop Walpola Rahula's ideas for promoting peace and social harmony. And there are also there is a Hindu organization as well as Islamic organization mentioned there. So I will end here. I know my two colleagues also want to contribute to this discussion, but I will ask them to wait until the question time. Then they can contribute.